Hi, Jeff.
Jeff, go ahead and give us a start.
Sure. Hi, everybody. And I'm Jeff Gedman. I'm pretty certain I know all of you. And so welcome and thank you for making time. And welcome Charles Davidson, our publisher and co-founder. And welcome out at Stanford, Frank Fukuyama, our other co-founder and chairman, who was with us for a talk yesterday. And really a fabulous group of contributing editors and friends, both in the United States and abroad. And hi, Abe, and hi, Shadi. What a pleasure and what a privilege to be with you two. But I don't have the pleasure and privilege of moderating you. That's to Demir, who does a splendid job with these things. And there's so much I would want to say about the subject and both of you, but we're dividing labor. So Demir, TAI, colleague and executive editor, over to you, sir.
Jeff, thank you very much. I'd like to welcome everyone. I just want to say a few words very quickly before we kick off. We are streaming live to YouTube, so for all of our participants that are here on the virtual roundtable here and on Zoom, we have your mics muted right now. Please take a second to make sure that you don't have the live stream running in the background because it creates a feedback loop and it's very disorienting. Second, to everyone concerned, we are recording this for posterity, so just keep that in mind. Finally, normal ground rules for Zoom for the people here within the room. We will have a question and answer session after our two distinguished guests speak. So please just either raise your hand or text me on the chat. To all of us joining us, to all of you joining us on YouTube Live, use the commenting feature there. One of my colleagues will be following that and will be feeding me potential questions. So we want to have a reasonably hard stop around noon, so I won't be very long-winded with the introduction. Liberalism and its antagonists is our subject today. I have learned so much over the years from both of our guests. Abe Shulsky from Hudson Institute wrote an excellent essay for us here at the American Interest in 2014 titled Liberalism's Beleaguered Victory. I encourage you all to read it. Our publisher, Charles Davidson, actually brought up this essay to me and our editor-in-chief, Jeff, the other day, and it's part of the impetus to discuss this. And our other discussant, Shadi Hamid of the Brookings Institution, is also no stranger to these kinds of debates. He's the author of the book Islamic Exceptionalism, and he's published extensively on the subject. Two essays from 2018 we circulated on email, but they're both worth your time. Post-Liberalism East and West, and the Rise of Anti-Liberalism, to be found in Foreign Affairs and The Atlantic, respectively. So, Abe, your essay is a starting point. I think given how illiberalism has taken more solid root in the West over the last 3 years, and not least among people on the right, especially here in the United States, we thought it'd be a good time to have a good open discussion about some of these issues. So why don't you start us off, Abe? Have Shadi come in after that, and we'll then open it up to questions and see where this takes us. Abe, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Demir and Jeff, for holding this, and Charles. I'm very pleased to be able to discuss all this with such a distinguished group. The article that you mentioned, I wrote, said in 2014, and it started from the sort of general, I think, sense that I had that while liberalism had been in the grand sense sort of victorious and had certainly in the 20th century vanquished both communism and fascism, its main ideological opponents. In addition, the strongest, the most prosperous countries, for the most part, really belonged in this liberal democratic camp. And this was not seen as accidental. This really had to do with the sort of fundamentals of the basic sort of political philosophic view, which was, on the one hand, that freedom and the rule of law had the effect of liberating everybody's talents, creativity, ingenuity, hard work. And that led to prosperity, as what Adam Smith called the constant concern of everyone to better their condition, had this sort of long-term effect of producing prosperous and hence militarily, or at least potentially militarily, strong countries. And at the same time, as various people argued, like Samuel Huntington, prosperity itself produced demands for freedom. In other words, once people became, middle class, he said 6,000 per capita kind of as a threshold, $6,000 per capita as a kind of threshold. Once they meet the immediate demands of making sure they're fed and so forth, they start demanding some right of participation in how they're governed. They want some sorts of self-respect, as Frank emphasized in end of history. And all of this meant that this was a kind of secure or potentially secure or strong sort of situation. Now, of course, even back then in 2014, China was a sort of exception. Certainly in the years since then, we've had less and less optimism about how the country is moving. And so that raised one question: is it possible to be strong and prosperous and not be liberal democratic, or even moving towards liberal democracy? There's the other question, which we can discuss later perhaps: does China really have a competing ideology, or is this just a sort of extremely successful form of authoritarianism that doesn't have a real basis other than the desire of the people in power to maintain power? But at any rate, given that first point, that a general success of liberal democracy, I was also struck by the fact that there were the continuous critiques of liberalism that come up throughout its whole history. Partly this, of course, has to do with the fact that liberalism allows such critiques. I mean, that people are free to sort of say what they want, by and large, including that the system is wrong and so forth. But at the same time, I think it really pointed to certain questions in liberalism, or certain ways in which liberalism was perhaps inadequate and it wasn't fully satisfying. And hence, there were always going to be these sorts of counter-ideologies. And in the article, I discuss that, and I try to characterize them in various ways. At the time, in 2014, the biggest practical opponent of liberalism in the world was probably Islamism, which made, of course, a very thorough critique on a religious basis and sort of spiritual basis, you can say, of the inadequacy of liberalism. But since that time, what we've seen, and what I assume you want to talk mainly about, is the growth of a sort of right-wing anti-liberalism, national conservatism, it's also called, that I think focuses a lot on a lack of national identity as being a problem of liberalism. And this has, this is both sort of an ideological point, that the notion that the nation brings sort of a kind of meaning and richness to human life, and having just a bunch of people who are free to go off in every direction they want sort of loses that or misses some of that. But I think it also had this practical side that for a lot of people who weren't, in a sense, being rewarded by the globalism, or weren't being successful in the globalized world, the loss of a national identity was particularly important. And now this gets into the whole question of inequality in economics and so forth. But fundamentally, I think it meant that there were a fair number of people who had a sense of being left behind by the new economic and technological trends, and I think equally important, disrespected by the people who were successful at this. The global elites, the Davos man, so forth, looked down on these people who were sort of not getting with the program in that sense. And in a way, I think one of the clearest cut cases of all this, which I'll just end with talking about, was the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests in France, the big opposition movement that got started. And it's just perfect. It got started because of a hike in the gasoline tax. Now, why is that so important? Well, for one thing, it fell disproportionately on your rural and far out suburban people who really depend on their cars. I mean, if you were living in the 7th arrondissement in Paris, you probably didn't even have a car. If you did, you certainly didn't need it to get around town. So it had that economic inequality, but it was also the justification that this was this great moral thing to do because it helped in climate change. It was the part of the green movement. It was ecological and so forth, sort of making it look like the people who depended on their cars to get around were somehow, less moral than the people who took the metro, even though in order to be living near a metro stop in Paris, you had to be paying some pretty high rents or buying a pretty fancy apartment for the most part. So anyway, I mean, that was a good sort of encapsulation, I think, of both the economic and the sort of other side of this, the disrespect, the ignoring of a large part of the country that wasn't really prospering and taking advantage of the new technologies in the same way. So let me stop there, and we of course can get into all of these questions in greater depth later.
Great, thanks, Abe, for those opening remarks. Shadi, why don't you say a couple of words, and we'll take it from there.
Great. First of all, thanks for having me. Good to be with all of you. So I'll just to start, let me say, just so you know where I'm coming from, I sort of think of myself as a liberal who's critical of liberalism. So I find that I'm often in conversation and in tension with myself, and I'm sometimes torn about these issues. So what I'll try to do is unpack that a little bit. I mean, first of all, I think we're in a really interesting natural experiment, at least those of us who are under lockdown. I guess if you live in Florida or certain red states, you no longer are. But it's a really interesting test in the sense that we've resolved the paradox of choice, at least for the time being, in the sense that there is a kind of coercive external constraint that reduces and limits our choices. So in that sense, we're not fully liberal beings now. We're not fully autonomous and we're not fully free. There's a lot of things, perhaps even most things, that we can't really do now. So we can't go out to a restaurant, you can't generally see most of your friends. Travel is limited. Most people are stuck in their apartments most of the time. So I think one interesting question is, do we become more happier, more fulfilled, or less happier and less fulfilled the more there are these external constraints on choice? So, and I think that critics of liberalism would hypothesize that yes, with this natural experiment, we would become happier and more fulfilled. And most of you will be familiar with the whole the behavioral economics around this, where different authors have talked. A famous experiment is the jars of jam experiment, where if you give people 30 jars of jam in a supermarket and you ask them to choose only one, you might think they'll be happy to have all these choices, but what ends up happening in practice is that they end up being really unhappy with their choice because they see that they had all these other options and they're overwhelmed by choice, right? And on the other hand, if you give them three jars of jam, like really basic flavors, and they choose, they end up being much more fulfilled and content with their choice. So we're literally living the jars of jam experiment day to day right now, right? And what I have found, and I'll just be a little bit open about like what the experiment has led me to conclude on my own. Obviously, I wish COVID never happened, to be clear. But in terms of like being stuck in my own apartment and being forced to live differently and to reflect on how I make decisions and how I make choices about what's important to me and what I value in my life, I'm starting to conclude that I am happier and more fulfilled with much less choice. The more constrained I am now, the more happier I seem to be now. We don't know how long that'll last. It may be the case that just for the first month or 2 months of lockdown, we feel this way, but then there's diminishing marginal returns. And then we start to actually realize that we might like aspects of this in the short term, but in the long term, we just cannot do this. So I accept that might be the case. Okay, so that's one thing I wanted to put out there as a kind of provocation. The second thing, and this is an argument that is not fully developed, but I thought that this would be the right place to test it with friends. And I guess there's also not friends, like random people on YouTube. So that's cool too. But as someone who has read the anti-liberals and post-liberals, and I'm even friends with some of them, and I've also spent a good chunk of my life studying a certain kind of anti-liberal in the Middle East, i.e. Islamist movement. So these are people I've literally spent hundreds of hours with over the course of the past 15 years in different guises. Now, I think what's really interesting is to see how anti-liberals and post-liberals in the West formulate their arguments. And we've seen them formulate more of their arguments in the past 3 to 4 years. So let's see, what are they coming up with? What are they telling us? And I think probably the best, and by best, I don't mean that I agree with it, just in terms of quality of argument, the best and most provocative outlining of what the anti-liberal vision looks like, both in theory and practice, is probably Adrian Vermeule's Integration from Within, published in American Affairs, for those of you who want to give that a read at some point. Now, he's the only person who takes it pretty far and goes into some pretty controversial territory, but even he, I don't think, has fully expounded on what his ideal state or what his ideal vision looks like. So the question that I'm kind of contending with now, why is it that most anti-liberals aren't going as far as they can? And they're almost holding back. And this is the same thing I would say with Islamists of the Muslim Brotherhood ilk, who I've spent the most time with in the Middle East. They're very coy. I don't want to, coy makes it sound like they're being insincere, but they're very careful, and almost they're suffering from a lack of confidence in terms of outlining details of what the alternative looks like in theory. And this suggests to me that because we're all still living in some sense in a liberal world where liberal ideas are dominant. So even people who are anti-liberal are constrained by that world. Try as they might to go beyond it, to supersede it or whatever, they still can't. What does that tell us? That tells us that liberalism, even if we look at its most vociferous and most articulate critics, is more powerful than we might think, even from the standpoint of its critics. That, for example, you don't have anti-liberals who are saying explicitly, hey, let's do away with religious freedom. They go out of their way to say, oh, we have our critiques, we have our concerns, but we're still pretty much on board with religious freedom. Most of them will say they're pretty much still on board with democracy, but they don't want it to be as liberal of a democracy. They want a vaguely more illiberal. But then when you say, what does this illiberal democracy look like? They're like, well, we're still going to have minimal freedoms. We still want to have some minority rights, or even most minority rights. We don't want to go against the Constitution. We don't want to work against the Constitution. We want to stay loyal to that. So this, and I'll just close here, this all tells us that first of all, one, they might not have the courage of their convictions, which suggests another alternative that deep down, even anti-liberals like too much of liberalism. Or they don't maybe like it, but they don't want to live in something that is too different from that. Or that once you live in a liberal world where there is a kind of end of history or a dominance of these ideas to one extent or another, it becomes too difficult to extract yourself from those frameworks and to make a completely alternative argument.
Okay, Shadi, that was a whole lot and really, really good. Abe, I'm going to let you respond. Let me just sort of pull out one or two things that just maybe just to sort of get us on the same page on this sort of stuff. I think it's really interesting, Abe, that you bring up the Gilets jaunes as a reaction to really modernity in a lot of ways and sort of the forgotten. But it's fascinating to me at the same time, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but that as an ideology, they had nothing to offer. And in fact, it was just an empty vessel. And, Marine Le Pen and the rest of them, they tried to take ownership of this thing, but they didn't. And this, I think, is maybe the bridge where what Shadi's talking about and what you were talking about can sort of get played out. Because on the one hand, there's the intellectual counter movements to liberalism, which seem to be seeking for some kind of fulfillment, for some kind of modern meaning. And this expresses itself in various politics. And on the other hand, there's this kind of inchoate, anger that perhaps they try to feed on, but it's not really necessarily a match. Anyway, just some quick thoughts, but please, Abe, all yours.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I don't know. On the question of the lockdown, I guess I'm on the other side of this. I'd be very happy to be rid of all this and back to my normal life. I'd even be happy to be back to taking the metro to the office and so on. So, but I think you're right that there are people who find that a certain amount of structure, a certain amount of constraint even, is actually very helpful for them. I just read a fantastic book that came out a few years ago by J.D. Vance called Hillbilly Elegy, which I'd recommend to people who are interested in this subject. It's a very powerful and interesting book. But one big part of his story is essentially the Marine Corps, where he certainly was under a lot more constraint than he was ever under before. But he also had a sense of purpose, and even, he said, a sense of agency, in other words, so that even though he was very constrained, he was expected to do things, and his own behavior was supposed to make a difference. And I don't know, that may be, in a way, the opposite of someone like myself being in the lockdown, who certainly is serving no purpose other than not contracting a virus by being here. I'm not really much helping anyone else fight this thing. And so I think that's an important part of it, is that the constraint may be important, but it has to be connected with some overall or general purpose. But on the question of the Gilets jaunes, you're absolutely right. I mean, it was just an anger, just a revolt of this combination of both sort of being disrespected and also having this, new tax on them and so forth. And that was just the last straw. But it does show, I think, the great difficulty that people have had, as Shadi said, of coming up with anything that's like a counter-ideology. I mean, you can see that in China, where they had this big thing about Confucianism and so forth. I mean, trying to sort of say, no, this isn't just an authoritarian state. We have a real ideal or a goal, and it's different from the liberal democratic one. I mean, that's a big change in China. 20 years ago, they would have said, oh, well, it took you, 100 years. It's going to take us 100 years. But the implication was we'll get there eventually. Now they're saying, generally speaking, quite the opposite. No, we don't want to go there. We're going our own way. But it's very hard to see exactly what that way is. And with respect to Confucianism, it's, I think I'm not an expert on the subject, but it just strikes me as fairly thin gruel. I mean, an extremely hyper-capitalist, wealth-seeking economy. is not really the Confucian ideal. So, I think there is an issue on someone like the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't know. I mean, some of them may be insincere or sort of gradualist, but on the other hand, they may not really have a sense, and I get that feeling, of what a true Islamic state would look like. That's what they claim they want, something that's truly Islamic, but in most cases wouldn't look like the old Taliban or something, but it would be somehow Islamic in spirit and in authentically such. And I don't think they really do have much of an idea, at least. But on the other hand, they may want more of that than they're willing to say at first. Well, let me stop there and then see what the sorts of questions.
We have a ton of questions coming up, but Shadi, if you want to take some response to this and maybe talk a little bit about this question of meaning, and you've written about this, in fact, how the Islamists, aren't deep, or at least in your experience, not deep theoreticians of this stuff, and are sort of swimming in liberalism despite sort of fighting against it. Say a few words and react as you choose, and then we'll open it up.
Yeah. So when you talk to Muslim Brotherhood folks and try to get some clarity from them on what their alternative looks like, they tend to fall back on symbolic gestures. They're still important and they would actually affect people's lives, but they're not. So for example, restricting alcohol consumption, or perhaps at some point banning it, Islamizing the educational curriculum, having more religious programming on state TV. You'd have maybe some sex segregation on certain levels of primary and secondary schooling, things of that sort. That's different, and that's more illiberal for sure. And they don't apologize for that. I mean, otherwise, what would be the point of being Islamist? They are different. They are distinctive. But they're not able to do a complete alternative vision or reworking. They're still thinking, certainly within the nation state. They can't think beyond the nation state. And this has been one of the critiques of Islamist parties like the Muslim Brotherhood, is that they can't think beyond the state. And now that's not surprising, because unless you are, I guess, 100 years old, you wouldn't, living under the final years of the Ottoman Caliphate, you've never lived under a caliphate. And even then, you would have been only like 4 years old or something. So in that sense, most Islamists are stuck, straitjacketed almost within the nation state, and that constrains the realm of the possible, right? So that's one thing. And I think Turkey's another good example of this. Someone who does have a lot of power and could theoretically do a lot to reshape society according to his own distinctive vision, President Erdogan, he's become more authoritarian, but he hasn't necessarily become that much more Islamist. And instead, I would say he looks a little bit more like an Islamic Orban, for better or worse, depending on your starting premises. So I think that it all suggests a certain kind of limitation. Now we can debate whether or not it's liberalism itself that is so constraining and so dominant, or it's the logic of the nation state that is so constraining and so dominant. Or you could argue that there's a kind of interesting intertwining, that the nation state, at least in certain ways, contributes to this this dominance. So generally speaking, even authoritarians pay lip service to minority rights. Even authoritarians pay lip service to minimal freedoms. They might not actually practice it in practice, but it's interesting that they still feel a need, with maybe the exception of countries like China that don't even really pretend, but most authoritarian countries feel they have to operate within that kind of vocabulary.
Okay, great. So like I said, we're getting a lot of questions piling up. Dalibor, Rohach, go ahead. You go first. Let me see. Great.
Damir, thank you. This was fascinating. I was struck when Shadi opened his remarks by pointing out that he felt actually more fulfilled and happier during the lockdown. I share to some extent that sentiment. I like the structure, I like the routine, but I was surprised that he didn't touch on this interesting paradox that really offered itself in the sense that some of the people who are the least happy with the lockdown are actually the proponents of this new illiberalism on the political right. Right, so I remember Adrian Bermude's, saying various sort of things critical of the lockdown on Twitter. I saw Sohrab Ahmari being critical of the lockdowns. Some people went even further. Rusty Reno of First Things said that it was cowardly to wear masks. so that to me is quite striking. People, once somebody else's idea of the common good is imposed on them, suddenly discover their inner libertarians, and that to me suggests that their alternative that they try to construct to contemporary liberalism might not be very robust, might not be very sort of driven with content. Not only they sort of refuse to articulate what it is that they mean by the common good, but there's a sort of assumption that they'll be the ones in charge and they'll be the ones sort of directing society towards some end. That once it's somebody else, once they get a taste of their own medicine, their commitment to illiberalism, I think, becomes somewhat weaker. So that's just a brief remark I wanted to share.
Yeah, it's. To what extent, let me train that into a question, maybe, Abe and Shadi. To what extent, then, is this a kind of cynical move? I mean, how instrumental, again, getting back to the Gilets jaunes thing, which I think is interesting, is that you have this sort of ideology, as Shadi, you're saying, is not really even, never really worked through to a certain extent, is reactionary, but doesn't really move people onto the, well, maybe it does move people onto the streets. The question is how cynical is this, right? Because you have this kind of these contradictions that Dalibor is talking about. How is there a there in this illiberalism? Put it that way.
Okay. Well, can I go now, or how do you want?
Please do, Abe. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, for one thing, the people who we're talking about now tend not to see the American society or European societies as particularly liberal anymore. I mean, they look more at what they see as a kind of totalitarian movement of those societies. In other words, it's one thing to say, okay, liberalism certainly, I think, understood and, from the bases of Locke and the rest of it, sort of reasonably leads you to something like gay marriage, or at least, if not that, some sense that, everyone's life is to be lived as they see fit. And that includes their sexual life, their partnerships, and so forth, and all of that. But then, of course, if you go beyond that to the point that saying that any criticism of this has to be punished or forbidden, or these bizarre cases like the one of the baker in Colorado and so on, where the liberal side is now sort of looking like it's imposing its views on everybody and sort of penalizing any expression of other views. So I think the lockdown sort of fits into that this is sort of shows for these people would probably show the sort of illiberal instincts of the liberal elites, who then say, okay, everybody has to stay home and so forth. But of course, there's one other big important point here, which is that, despite the stuff that says, we're all in this together, of course, we're not. And I mean, the people on this call, I'm sure, well, actually, Frank, I'm just repeating what Frank said yesterday, actually, there's a lot of people for whom it's been a minor problem. I mean, I think it's a big nuisance, but it doesn't really harm me economically. It doesn't make me worry about my future. It doesn't really impinge on me in a very big way. But of course, there's 20 some odd million people who have lost their jobs. So that's a very different kind of effect of this whole thing. And so again, I get the sense, and I sort of went from, if you just watch television and you just see the sort of public service type ads that companies are running now, saying about, oh, well, since you're all sheltering in place, we're going to, provide this service, or we help in this way, or, they just show nice pictures of people, hugging their kids or something. There's a large part of the country for whom either staying in place means not having an income, or who are actually going out and earning their income and running risks that other people aren't. So there's a kind of disrespect in the public discussion of this that I think a lot of these people are reacting to, and who knows what the longer term effects would be. But on the point about a real clear case of what people want, I think you're right. I mean, that you get very little sense of that. I mean, especially in the US, because the sort of the liberalism and the Constitution are much more deeply ingrained here. In Europe, I suppose there are some people who are out and out fascists in the technical sense, that they really would, given the choice, do what the Nazis did to Germany when they got the chance. I mean, there may be such people. I assume there are, but I don't know how many. For the United States, I always get the sense that people want to sort of go back to the 1950s in a way, but without the blemishes, without segregation and so forth. With a sort of, mainly without segregation. I don't know about the other things, but certainly they would say, no, that was wrong, and we shouldn't have that, and so forth. But that they want the atmosphere of the 50s of a much greater restraint on the part of society, a much greater sense of the importance of religion, much more public talk about religion, and nobody complaining about a Christmas display in the department store window and that sort of thing.
Shadi, any thoughts on that, or should we go to the next?
Yeah, sure. Just very quickly, what Abe said made me think about some of my interviews with AfD figures in Germany when I was there in October, that they would, AfD being the main right-wing populist party in Germany, alternative for Germany, that they defended their anti-Muslim sentiment, which they would be careful to couch by saying, well, we're not racist, but, which is always a tell, I guess. You don't start a sentence that way. But they would defend anti-Muslim sentiment on liberal grounds, saying that the Muslim minority in Germany and in Europe more broadly is too religiously conservative, too observant, and too illiberal, and they are threatening the liberal gains of Europe and Germany in terms of gender equality, secularism, not having too much religion in the public sphere, so on and so forth. That's also the case with right-wing populists in a number of other countries, including in the Netherlands, Sweden, Finland, and so on. So that's a really interesting development. I'll also just, and just a quick point in response to what Dalibor said, which I hadn't actually thought of it in those terms. And I think Dalibor is right to point to a certain tension, but even I share it. I've become, I generally have been pretty pro-lockdown, but that's starting to erode. And I've become more critical in recent weeks about how some on the center left and left have been talking about this maximalist approach to lockdown, and how anyone who disagrees with that is in effect supporting mass murder or sacrificing Americans on the altar of the economy. So we're hearing what I consider to be pretty far out rhetoric. I don't think that people who are anti-lockdown, like Rusty Reno, we might disagree with them, but are they calling for mass murder? I'm not comfortable with that. And when Mayor Bowser here in DC announced an extension of stay-at-home orders until June 8th, my instinct was to say, I don't know if I'm on board with this. I'm becoming more open to some of the arguments about, look at Florida and other states. I was about to say other countries, but sorry, other American states. They are states that are reopening more quickly and never even had that anything resembling a serious lockdown. And we should be willing to look and say, well, oh, did they maybe do better than we may have expected? Florida does seem to have done better than the worst case scenarios. So how do we explain this? And I don't actually know the answer. And Dalibor, I thank you for what you said, because that's something I'll want to work through. Why is it that I seem to like some of the constraints of lockdown, but I'm becoming more critical of lockdown myself? And I would suspect that one answer to that is because I'm reacting to liberal dominance in the public debate. And I assume that's part of what's driving Sohrab Ahmari and Rusty Reno. And unfortunately, I think those who are critical of liberalism can't help but be at least somewhat reactionary. And this is I think one of the weaknesses of anti-liberalism. And we find something similar with Islamists in the Middle East, that they can only be Islamist insofar as they know they're opposite. So Islamism only makes sense in contradistinction to secularism. Islamism did not exist before secularism. So I think that's part of what's going on here.
Yeah, it's just to hear you guys talk. It strikes me, especially on Dalibor's question, how instrumental the counter ideology is in any case, right? And how it's able to pivot around these sorts of issues, and it's not really consistent because it is reactionary, as you say, Shadi. Okay, guys, I'm going to try and start grouping people in two because we really do have a lot. So, Ron, could you ask your question, Ron Dworkin, and then after that, I've got Giselle Donnelly. Go ahead, Ron.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
I'm going in and out of my internet, so sorry about that. I'd like to ask my question in. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. By way of an analogy, I have a housekeeper. About 2 months ago, before the quarantine, she was furiously sweeping the house, sweeping the dirt outside the house to the yard. And I asked her, I told her, don't worry about it so much. And she said, oh, thank you. My last employer was really very obsessive about cleanliness in the house. And I said, don't worry, a house is necessarily a dirty place. Now, the analogy here is this. Liberalism thinks that crazy ideologies are like dirt that can be kept out of a house, but they can't be. They will always be coming back because a house is necessarily a dirty place, just as a society is necessarily a dirty place. And so the presumption of liberalism that it is not an ideology and it can keep these other ideologies at bay is already wrong. The other issue is I looked up her previous employer. He was an upper middle class knowledge worker. And he also had his own identity, his own ideology, and that was to keep a clean house. But he, of course, had the money to have a housekeeper to do so. And so in a way, the liberal position is wrong about keeping ideologies at bay. And it's wrong about itself because it too has an ideology. Of course, it's a luxury and only certain people could enjoy it. So I wonder if you can take that into account in understanding the problems of liberalism today.
Thanks, Ron. That's terrific. Giselle, go ahead. Let's take two at once, and then we can keep the conversation moving forward.
Okay. I'll try to be quick. Although I have to observe that Shadi's embrace of the lockdown probably lasted about 20 minutes. So I think that's a testament to the strength of the underlying liberalism he was describing, which is also kind of my question about both the discontents on the left and the right end of the political spectrum. It does seem there to be both. There's a materialism and a presentism about these critiques that really makes you wonder whether there's how durable they will be or how instrumental they are, to put it in Damir's terms. These cycles come and go. We have an end of an era, about once every 75 or 80 years. whether it was James Burnham or Oswald Spengler or, some of the older iterations of this phenomena that I've written about. But also the critiques seem to be centered on economic concerns, particularly in strikes me as opposed to the political durability of liberal societies. Again, they seem to be built for the long run. Certainly, if you take the American and British examples of the last 500 years or so, and also their strategic success, that ability to take a licking and keep on ticking, to quote the old Timex commercial. Our successes in wars and other competitions aren't necessarily triumphs at the beginning, but just because of the sort of pluralistic nature of decision making and the society, our ability to stick to things, even in a contentious situation or in a seemingly a dire situation, has been pretty remarkable. Again, if you sort of open the aperture a little bit and consider it over the course of centuries rather than over the course of a few years or decades.
Thanks, Giselle. Abe, Shadi, do you guys want to each take one of those, and we'll keep going?
Okay. Well, to Ron's point, I think, yes, it's true that liberalism is a sort of ideological position, even though it sort of claims to be a non-ideological position, and that's part of the problem that it always gets into. But I think more importantly, on the question of why there are always going to be these counter-ideologies, is that liberalism just has a certain kinds of assumptions that I think work out most of the time for most people, but are strictly speaking not true. In other words, we talk about a right to life, and that's in the Declaration of Independence. That was sort of a basis for Hobbes and Locke and so on. And yet that life can be protected against violence, perhaps, and against disease, although in this particular case, we're having some difficulty, but I assume we will eventually succeed. But there's still, human beings are still mortal, which still raises all sorts of other questions that liberalism says, yes, well, that's fine. You can go off and privately on Sundays or Saturdays or whenever, worry about that part of it. But in the public square, we sort of don't bring in the questions of mortality, even though we are in fact mortal. And there's sort of the same thing for our social instincts. I mean, human beings, if you look at primatology and evolutionary psychology and the rest of it, didn't evolve as individuals. We evolved as parts of groups. I mean, this goes back to before the even human, specifically human species and so forth. And so we do have certain instincts that, again, have to play out, but aren't supposedly recognized in a major political intellectual way. So there are these entry points, so to speak, for all the dirt that Ron was talking about, that there are things that liberalism doesn't really satisfy and can't satisfy and doesn't pretend, in a sense, to satisfy, except that they are there and they sort of percolate around. Now, I just say to Giselle's point, I mean, yes, precisely, that liberalism, my teacher, Leo Strauss, used to say that Hobbes and Locke built on low but solid ground. They had premises that were not noble or elevated in particular, but they certainly were solid in the sense that they referred to what most of the people are concerned with most of the time. And I think that does give us our stability and our stick-to-itiveness. And, hopefully we'll continue, but, we're constantly going to see the attacks.
That's a great Strauss quote. Shadi, go ahead. Sorry.
So, I mean, first of all, and this might be partly my bias, I don't think human beings naturally incline towards liberalism. And I think that should be obvious insofar as for millennia, the vast majority of human beings who have been alive have not been liberal. So that should probably tell us something. And I think that actually, Frank Fukuyama, who I think is still on this call, I mean, he has there's some really good quotes in Origins of Political Order about how liberalism can only really come to be by sort of there has to be some aspect of pushing people in that direction, because they won't necessarily go there or get there on their own. And I will say that as someone who likes liberalism, but is also critical of it, it doesn't feel completely natural to me. The more liberalism becomes its own ideology, that's where we really start to have a problem, because then we get into the question of the quest for meaning, that because liberalism can provide ultimate meaning, and by ultimate meaning, I mean helping humans contend with mortality, which I think is pretty important, especially now under COVID. And I think we might actually see a religious awakening, because there's actually was an interesting Pew poll about 20% of Americans have felt more religious or become more religious since the pandemic started, and only like 2% have become less religious. I mean, that tells us something, that, hey, we kind of need religion the more we're thinking about death. And if we keep on thinking about death more and more in the coming years and decades, and if you add to that climate change and other pandemics that might actually be our new normal, hey, this is, liberalism can't do much about that. But unfortunately, liberalism, I think, has a natural trajectory where it starts to become more aggressive and more expansive, and doesn't allow as much room for religion and alternative sources of meaning. I think we've seen that in Europe, that public religiosity is discouraged, at least in Western Europe, considerably. And I think that if you live in an urban center, urban areas, Washington, D.C., New York, people don't necessarily force you to become less religious. Of course they don't, but it's really uncool to be openly and outwardly religious, and you're seen as odd, weird, strange. So there's a kind of stigmatization of people who believe in God and who believe in an afterlife. And that's not a healthy trajectory. And the question then, does liberalism is that what liberalism will always end up doing? Or can it stay more in its classical liberal, its old, more traditional form, where it allows more space for a kind of coexistence with Christianity, which even as a non-Christian, I think is important.
Excellent. So next we have Gary Schmitt. Gary, can you hear us?
Yeah, I
Great.
can. Thanks. So try to put this pretty quick. So much of the discussion about populism here in Britain and elsewhere is about the folks who have been left behind by the expansion of, the larger global liberal order. But I wonder whether or not, in fact, this misses some liberalism in the populist movement, which is to say, the feeling in Britain, here, elsewhere, in reaction to the sense that a large amount of public policy issues were being decided by people who they actually hadn't voted for, who they actually had no say with. So one wonders whether or not, the question, I guess, is there a kind of a healthy liberalism within populism as we see it today? Thanks.
Thanks, Gary. And I've also got our colleague, Aaron Sibarium. Go ahead, Aaron. Question, please, though.
Okay, sure. So, Shadi, you've written a lot about the importance of conflict and agonism in democracy. And it occurs to me that I think there's a link between what you've written about there and what you were just saying about sort of COVID's effect on our metaphysical, theological assumptions. Because if you look at the people like Reno and some of the other sort of post-liberal critics of lockdowns, there's this refrain, which is that, death always happens. death is not the end. There are more important things than avoiding death. Get over it. It seems to me that part of what we have here is, in fact, a conflict between pretty irreconcilable worldviews and metaphysical assumptions. And part of what we're seeing, you could argue, is both the importance of kind of agonism and fighting it out, but also the limits of liberalism and arbitrating these disputes, because it's just not clear, how you have a debate when one side comes in thinking very rationally, death is the worst thing in the world because there's nothing after. And the other side, very rationally from their perspective, comes in thinking, you know what? Death's not the end and you guys are freaking out. Comment on sort of the incommensurability of values here and how we navigate that.
Okay, gentlemen, please take one or both, or however you want to do that. Abe?
Okay, well, in response to my friend Gary's question, there is a way in which, liberalism, as it starts to impose its tolerance on, or its notion of tolerance and equality on everyone, then becomes somewhat, oppressive. I mean, we have this remarkable situation now where if you talk about free speech on campus, you're regarded as right-wing. I mean, this is quite a change from the past, and reflects the fact that in liberalism implies or is based on a notion of mutual tolerance of people on a sort of equality, at least in the political sense among people. And obviously that may require some enforcement. I mean, you can't allow lynching on the basis of liberalism just because some people want to do it, because that violates the basic principles. So on the other hand, if you make those principles and you can come up with extreme versions of them, which we've been doing in some circumstances, in which just saying something that's mildly critical of somebody is, conflated with intolerance and failure to recognize their equality, which then obviously has major effects on freedom of speech. So I think maybe some of that has to do with when liberalism becomes not just the means of our living together and pursuing our happiness as we each see fit and so forth and so on, but becomes the kind of ideal to be pursued, becomes the purpose of some people or some group of people, then it is going to be subject to this. And I think Gary's absolutely right that a lot of the reaction to it that goes by the name of populism is in fact a sort of a liberal reaction to this kind of extreme misunderstanding of liberalism as a kind of goal of life, in a sense, as opposed to a way of living together.
Shadi?
So on populists, I would maybe modify a bit and say that sometimes right-wing populists are more democratic than liberals are, and liberals are more liberal than they are democratic. Obviously, there'd be quite a lot to unpack there, but just to kind of acknowledge that there is here a tension in our terminology between liberalism, small L liberalism, small D democracy. Obviously, there can be some overlap in that you can't have a full democracy without having some minimal level of freedom of expression and so on. But still, they're different concepts. Aaron brings up a really interesting point, and I recall that in one of his early press briefings, but my sense of time is distorted, so I don't know when that would have been. Donald Trump said something that I thought was fascinating. He said, quote unquote, "The whole concept of death is terrible." And I tweeted in response to that, like, oh, that's like it's hard to argue with that. That's pretty sensible. But then after I tweeted that, some of my, some Christian tweets said, Shadi, actually, no, that's not a good thing for him to say. That's actually a profoundly un-Christian thing for Donald Trump to say. And it shows that he doesn't have any sort of natural Christian sensibility. Death is not terrible, Shadi, which showed that I'm, as much as I'm a believer. I study religion. That's part of like my everyday life. But even I'm so much a product of a liberal world that I saw Donald Trump saying that. I'm like, yeah, that's reasonable, right? But maybe it's not as reasonable as we might think. So I think, Aaron, you really got, and that's probably why I have, even though I disagree, as a disclaimer, I mean, I have a vague sympathy for aspects of Rusty Reno when he talks about death and how that society cannot see, should societies see the prevention of death as the ultimate goal and something that has to be done at all costs. And I emphasize at all costs. So if completely, and this is hypothetical because this is not actually how it is in real life, then it's a false binary, the whole economy versus saving lives thing. But let's say hypothetically that the only way to save a significant number of lives was literally to destroy the economy completely and utterly for like 5 years. Then if we put it in those stark terms, then I think we'd be able to clarify what we prioritize as a society. And I suspect that, it would be reasonable to say that maybe we shouldn't like that anyway. But then we get into this issue that people who don't believe in an afterlife, should they be subject to people who do believe in an afterlife? Because obviously you can't be compelled to believe in something you don't believe. And I just mean that from a theoretical standpoint. So if those are people who think that society should privilege more the fact that there is something after this life, that leads to a kind of stratification between citizens if you make that a basis of public policy. Because if this is all there is from your perspective as someone who doesn't believe in an afterlife, then would you really want people to be like, death is not the end? Because for you, death is the end, quite literally.
So we have a handful of more questions, but honest question for you, Abe and Shadi. Do you have a little bit more time, or we can just also wrap it up and take it to Twitter, as it were?
I mean, I do. I am at your behest if you want to stay.
Okay. Well, then let's just quickly, one last round then. I have 3. Please, as I call on you, do it in, briefly in the form of a question, and then I'll let you guys wrap up and we'll call it a meeting. James, you're next, please. James Barnett.
Yeah, thanks, Tamir. Thanks, Shadi. Thanks, Abe. I guess, simply put, my question is, to what extent on the American right do you think that post-liberalism actually has kind of a tangible support basis as opposed to it just being kind of a trendy intellectual phenomenon in a few journals, certain circles in DC? It seems that there's still a lot of tension and kind of that very much that libertarian and kind of culturally libertarian, if not always economically libertarian trends on the American right.
That's a great question, James. Nicole Penn, you're next, please.
Hi. So my question is about what role does enchantment and disenchantment have to play in the liberalism debates? Is what we're seeing, as to quote, Ross Douthat, as our society slides through this decadent moment where it seems like we've all established a pretty decent standard of living, but we're not answering these questions of meaning. Are movements like, fundamentalist Islam or the integralist movement on the Catholic right really a response to this need to be part of something greater? And could perhaps the answer for liberalism be a sort of breakthrough technological moment that allows us to, for example, break through the frontier of space? Would that help to perhaps reinstill a sense of enchantment in liberalism and its possibilities to feed this fundamental human need to be part of something greater?
Another excellent question. And then finally, the last one, Martin Skold, please. Floor is yours.
Thanks. I'll try to be as brief as I can. I guess my question is, to what extent are we seeing actual ideological challenges to liberalism as opposed to just effective partisanship? We've touched on this a number of different ways. By the way, this is not, I think, the first time we've politicized an epidemic. There was a round of this in 2014 over whether to close air traffic to Africa. We've been at this for a while. We've had a few warning shots. I would argue, and we could pull out a bunch of examples, but I'll spare you. But I would argue that if you look at anybody's Facebook feed that has a decent balance of left and right, you'll find a lot of people shouting at each other simply because they want to align with their team and show that we are not like those guys, and test you to see which side you're on. And as much as I would like to say there's some necessity behind it, I think in some ways people do it because they're bored. Regardless of exactly how we got there, how much of the challenge of liberalism is philosophical as opposed to psychological, tribal, sociological in the digital age where we simply have to wear a jersey?
I think those are three excellent questions that happen to go well together. And actually, I'm really pleased that we're wrapping up on this. So gentlemen, Abe, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, on the question of is there a real sort of ideological basis of the post-liberalism or the anti-liberalism, the populism, my impression is that if there is, it hasn't really been developed yet. And in this country, I think it would have a very difficult time because the sort of constitutional principles are so deeply ingrained. Clearly, as mentioned, I mean, the polarization, tears away at the sort of fundamental liberalism because it sort of suggests that there's really no compromise possible. There's there's a sort of inherent fight that's going on now. I don't know exactly how we get out of that. It would be nice if it were possible to tone it down somewhat, but that doesn't mean that anyone has a particularly clear vision of what kind of society they might want to produce. Now, in Europe, it may be a little different. I mean, I don't know. I mean, take the case like Orban or even Putin, who, again, I mean, technically is democratically elected and sort of totally controlled elections. But he sort of keeps looking around for something, and Russian nationalism certainly played that role, and the Orthodox Church. He's tried to make into a sort of center of Russian life. I mean, I get the sense that it's not very real. In other words, it doesn't have a very strong basis. Orban certainly has a great popularity in Hungary, and there's a kind of basic Hungarian nationalism that exists because it's among other things just a very different ethnic group of people, I mean, in terms of language and so on, from their neighbors. But again, I don't know that I heard him in a conversation with Chris DeMuth at this, this conference they had back in Rome. And for all of that he said, he didn't really say much about what the basis of what he saw for the country. I mean, it was just Hungarian nationalism, but without much content. And interestingly enough, I mean, in the case like Orban and even Erdogan, and for that matter, Putin, all of them have these pro-natalist policies, because if nationalism presumably means anything, there ought to be, a population that can sustain itself. And in none of those three cases is that happening now. And that's been a great frustration for these leaders, which sort of tells me that somehow they haven't really touched the vital nerve. The interest in space thing, I think that could be. I mean, one of the things that could sort of give meaning in liberal times is science. I mean, certainly the people devoted to the scientific life find that as a basic kind of goal, and for the populace as a whole, the space program used to provide that to a certain extent. Whether that'll happen now, I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting question, whether a serious attempt to colonize the moon or Mars or space stations or whatever would sort of give a feel for a sense of purpose of human life that's otherwise missing. I don't know. That's an interesting point. Yeah.
Shadi, take us out on meaning, on enchantment, on any of it, politics. Go ahead.
Yeah, on whether post-liberalism is just an elite preoccupation in DC and in other certain places, I would say that Trump is the first American president who I would say is definitively outside the classical liberal tradition. I would say that Trump, if I had to describe him, is something of a post-liberal or even an anti-liberal. But people can disagree on that, I suppose. But certainly in my lifetime, I can't speak to the way things were well before I was born. But at least, in the recent modern era, Trump stands apart. And I think he also represents an intellectual trend. To say that Trump represents an intellectual trend, pushing things a little bit. But there are those who, in his name, trying to create a kind of Trumpist intellectual framework. And that to me seems like it could be compelling on a mass scale. Like, I think folks like Senator Josh Hawley and who else? Tucker Carlson, I think, represent this kind of interesting melding of economic populism with kind of social conservatism, and we'll have to see where that can go. And certainly, it's had some success in Europe. As for space, personally, I'm not really into space, and I'm trying to think about why it doesn't appeal to me. I think part of the issue is that for those who are obsessed with space, like Elon Musk or something, I think I sort of interpret it as a way to supplant God and to make the world more human-centric about what humans can accomplish. It makes us bigger, when I think what we should really be looking at is how to make us a little bit more modest or humble about what we are able to achieve in this world. And I don't think space really speaks to the question of mortality, at least not in a very straightforward way. And then there was, and that's why I think that we have to find ways to effectively intertwine liberalism with religion, and in our case as Americans, Christianity. And others have written about this, like Andrew Sullivan, and this has become, I think, a more popular argument that, and this would be to some extent something that Ross Douthat would be, I think, sympathetic to, that for liberalism to be less maximalist and to be more moderated, it has to have some stronger religious tradition of which it is a part. And and I think, but the question is, how do you do that? You can't make people more religious if they've already lost religion. And this is where I think that one natural solution would be just if Americans somehow, I don't know, I mean, and a pandemic might be one way that it happens, that Americans somehow on their own decide that they want to be more religiously oriented. That would help address some of this. Until now, though, Americans have become gradually less Christian, less religious, and this would go not just for Christians, but also for Muslims. And I've also written about how American Muslims have become more liberal over time in this country for a variety of reasons. Again, showing how powerful the liberal idea can be, even with what I would argue has traditionally been the religion that is most resistant to classical liberalism or to modern liberalism. So, but I guess that's why the next 10 to 20 years are going to be quite frightening, but also quite fascinating.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us at the roundtable, and those on YouTube still watching. Thanks for tuning in. For me personally, this was very rich. What strikes me ultimately is, Abe, both your essays and Shadi's that, we cited at the beginning, these are a few years old, still very vital, but it's interesting how I do think that the discussion is shifting about this this question of meaning and the challenges that there are. Lots of food for thought. And I hope to have both of you on something like this soon, and perhaps in our pages, if all goes well. So thanks again. Thanks to Charles Davidson, our publisher, and Jeff Gedman, our editor-in-chief. And catch you all next time. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me, Damir.
Yep.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.